you very much for being here. So I guess we can just dive into it. So as a leader in infrastructure financing and a key enabler of ESG-linked capital flows, we look forward to your insights on ESG trends that are shaping investor behavior and what it means for Pakistan's infrastructure and capital markets. So let's begin with the bigger picture. So the recent World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report reported state-based conflict, extreme weather, and misinformation as top global risks, right? Would you say this aligns with what are the key pressing ESG risks in Pakistan? And if not, do you think there are some risks that we are ignoring or underestimating?
No, thank you for that, Shafaq, and thank you to PICG for having me here. It's always a pleasure. So I think, look, with Pakistan, with every country, ESG risks are always specific and should be really looked at in the context of the market that we're operating in. So I think the WEF definition is quite broad. When we think Pakistan and we think, where is the ESG risk? And by ESG, if you talk about the environment, you talk about social, and you talk about governance. I think within each of those, there are specific risks that Pakistan is addressing. I would say we are actually doing quite well in terms of developing our standards to be far more encompassing than they have been in the past. So if I start with the first one, which really relates to environment, I think that if we talk about climate, we know that we are very climate vulnerable, but I also do think that the efforts that we have made towards climate mitigation is certainly to be commended. One of those is obviously the transition that we're seeing towards renewable energy, which is picking up quite significantly. But I do think that the adaptation part of the environment and climate is something Pakistan still needs to work towards. One of the things that we don't do in Pakistan, and that is now being done actually across a lot of Asia, is building in climate risk into our project level assessments, right? Or into our company level assessments. So for example, as a company where you build your annual budget, or you are looking at a new expansion, or you're looking at a new project, we base it very much on the numbers, right? So we base it on the financial model of what is the capex outlay, what's the working capital requirement, what will be the sales projections, etc. But now more and more, the risk assessment is including the climate potential risk assessment, right? With that. That's something we're not doing here yet. And I think it's absolutely crucial, given how vulnerable we are to climate events, to build that in particularly when it comes to water, when it comes to flooding, when it comes to these factors. We don't account for any kind of business disruption because of these factors. And this is now becoming, we've had a flood almost every 10 years for the last 10 years, and every 5 years it gets worse and worse. So why aren't we building in these climate risks into our forward-looking projections when we're making budgets, when we're planning for expansions, and so on and so forth. So I think that's one key thing that we absolutely must look at. The other one, when we talk about social, right? So there's been a lot of talk around the social sort of context of businesses. In particular, we tend to focus on gender as a big one, given where we stand in the gender equity index. I do think this is a big cultural barrier. It's not something the corporate sector can address on its own, but I'm confident, and I'm hopeful at least, that with the new SECP sort of gender equity suggestions and regulations that they're bringing through, at least in the corporate sector, we will begin to address those in a more quantitative way than we've done in the past. And finally, when it comes to governance, so I think our governance and transparency, particularly when you look at our code of corporate governance, you look at the listed companies, it's pretty much at world standard. There are obviously improvements that you can make, but we have all the sort of nuts and bolts that we need within the governance framework. It's about implementing them beyond the listed company space and pushing for mandatory compliance rather than keeping it limited to a subset of listed companies. So that's kind of where we see Pakistan in the context of what's happening within ESG globally.
Right. So, Maheen, coming back to the climate part that you were discussing, do you see or have you seen any significant climate solutions coming about from the private sector? And specifically, how is Ifrazamin, driving any ESG aligned innovation?
Right. So we, all our projects carry that ESG element in them, right? So they carry that, what we call that development impact. You refer to that as ESG, and we tend to drill it down very specifically into quantifiable outcomes and link it back to sustainable development goals and try and come up with good assessments of the number of people that would be positively impacted through those projects, right? So but our work is quite unusual in the sense that not everyone's, looks at it with that development lens. When it comes to the private sector and climate, like I said, the focus is really on solarization, renewable energy, other forms of renewable energy such as wind, and potentially also looking at the circular economy through recycling of, say, oils and fats and other waste materials for either energy or then for fuels, right? So that's where the private sector is sort of moving, and I think that's coming from obviously the commercial aspect of all of these things making business more viable. But sort of the real challenge that we have in Pakistan is one of adaptation, right? What do you do when there is a flood? What do you do when we have changes in the seasons when it comes to rainfall, right? We haven't really quite addressed those, and I think our agri sector in particular is very vulnerable to those seasonal changes that you're seeing. So there are projects that are happening, but very much on the margins, and certainly not mass. I think there's a huge need to build capacity in this area to understand which projects would be more suitable from a Pakistan perspective. I give you a simple example. We tend to solarize our tube wells, and that's something that's happened across the agri space. What happens when there's a flood and your solar panels are not at the right ground level and they become flooded, so you cannot generate that electricity, right? So there are thought processes that you have to bring in to make sure that the adaptation part of climate is included in your project. I think in Pakistan specifically, that capacity is still lacking.
Right. So Maheen, you mentioned the commercial aspect, right? So everything has to have a business case. So in terms of the recent amendments to the Code of Corporate Governance, where boards are required to provide oversight over ESG strategy, so do you think they're doing it as an operational tick box, or do you think they're actually taking that commercial lens and investor lens into consideration?
So I think it is a conversation that is slowly opening up a lot more beyond just the checkbox. I think in the past, ESG was just confused with CSR, which it clearly obviously isn't. And I do think now at the board level, there is now a lot of discussion, a lot of debate on how to demonstrate deeper ESG compliance. And we are moving towards S1, S2 accounting standard reporting in a couple of years now, I think, right? So I think the conversation is changing at the board level, while there is a lot of focus on business and growth, and those things will always be part of that. But at the board level, there is now focus on saying, okay, where do we build in ESG into the strategy of the company? What can we demonstrate? What can we measure? And how long will that take to actually implement? So I do think it's happening. It's happening in various speeds, depending on which company you speak to. But there's a very high recognition now that this is something that the world is moving towards, we are moving towards. And I think the conversation in Pakistan, if you pick it up from where it was 3 years ago, where we were just beginning to talk about ESG.
So Maheen, in terms of materiality, ESG materiality, the investor lens versus the regulator's lens, do you think there's an alignment here in what they are considering important for the market and what they are focusing on?
So I think the big disconnect is what? The big disconnect is there's a desire for ESG compliance from the regulator's perspective. There's a desire to push the market towards accepting ESG as a business as usual framework. However, where's the incentive to actually do so? Right? So we always have to have more than just a stick. There also has to be the carrot, right? And if you look at what's happening across Asia, there are significant incentives being given to companies to develop greater ESG compliant in whichever space you're looking at, right? So for example, if you want to encourage issuers in capital markets to come forward with green instruments, what's the incentive for them to do so? Do we have any grant programs which cover the cost of accreditation? When we want to build smart cities and we want to build green construction, where's the incentive for the sector to actually implement that, right? Is there something we can give them? And it doesn't always have to be a tax break. It can just simply be a tax increase on normal activities and a different taxation on green activities, right? So, there are many ways to build in incentives, but unfortunately at this point, that's lacking. So if someone is moving to ESG compliance, it is either something which is done under a mandatory framework, or then it is done because it is good to have and must to have, particularly when you're talking about the exporting sector, which needs to show that compliance in order to be able to create new markets. But by and large, for the vast majority of Pakistani businesses, and I'm talking now the unlisted space rather than the listed space, I don't think it really is a priority other than where commercially it can make sense. So I think that is something that needs to be very closely looked at. And markets move on incentives, right? So the private sector will move on whichever incentive you push it towards. And that doesn't always have to be tax, because I think tax is a sensitive subject at the moment, but there are many other sort of examples that you can pull from the region, from Asia, particularly China, where they have really taken the lead on how to build in green, how to build in climate into regular business decision making for all their companies.
Maheen, any closing call to action?
Well, I think the call to action is at the PICG level, at the government level, there is a need to build capacity and understanding of what ESG actually entails and how that can be used to benefit Pakistani corporates in the business case rather than simply checking boxes of compliance. So if we can create those commercial incentives, I think you'll find the uptake to be organic and very fast. And that's our hope as we go forward in the next 5 years for Pakistan.
Right. Thank you so much, Maheen, and we look forward to other initiatives also. We didn't get around to the green sukuks and the bonds, but hopefully next time we can do a dedicated webinar on it. Thank you so much, Maheen, for your time.